Hello, friends. Hello, hello, hello. Today we are going to read some more. I think this is episode 5. 3, 4, 5. Episode 5. And today we're going to read some more of The Absent Author. We're going to read some more of that so that we can continue on and find out what happened to Wallace Wallace, who is the author. Okay, we're going to read 3 more chapters of this today. If you remember, when we left off, they had thought that Wallace Wallace, the famous author, was going to come to Greenlawn and sign some books at the Book Nook, but he didn't ever show up. And so Dink and Ruth Rose and Josh think that he has been kidnapped, and they are going to track him down. Chapter 4. Mr. Paskey shooed them out of the Book Nook and locked the front door. I have to eat lunch, he said. He scurried down Main Street. Come on, Dink said. There's a phone at Ellie's Diner. Good, we can eat while you're calling. Josh stopped. Who are you calling? The airport, Dink said, to see if Wallace Wallace was on that 7 o'clock flight last night. They walked into Ellie's Diner just as Jimmy Fallon and his grandfather came out. Jimmy was working on a triple-decker chocolate cone. Ellie stood behind the counter. As usual, her apron was smeared with ketchup, mustard, chocolate, and a lot of other stuff that Dink didn't recognize. Ellie smiled. Hi, Dink. Butter crunch, right? Dink shook his head. No thanks, Ellie. I came to use the phone. Excuse me, but would it be all right if I bought you each a cone? Mavis Green asked. I was going to buy lunch for Mr. Wallace anyway. Gee, thanks, Josh said. I'll have a scoop of mint chip and a scoop of pistachio. Oh, you like green ice cream too? Mavis said. She smiled shyly. I'll have the same, please. I like pink ice cream, Ruth Rose said. I'll have a strawberry cone, please, 1 scoop. How about you, Dink? Mavis asked. I'm not hungry, thanks, he said. But you guys go ahead. I'm going to call the airport. Dink felt guilty. If he hadn't invited Wallace Wallace to Greenlawn, his favorite author would be safe at home in his castle in Maine. But Dink couldn't help feeling excited, too. He felt like a detective from one of Wallace Wallace's books. That is Ellie, and they're at her diner, and Mavis, Ruth Rose, and Josh. There's Dink back there, making a phone call. Dink stepped into the phone booth, looked up the number for New England Airlines, and called. When a voice came on, he asked if Wallace Wallace had been aboard Flight 3132 last night. He was? Did it land at 7 o'clock? Dink asked. Thanks a lot. He rushed out of the phone booth. Hey, guys, they told me Wallace Wallace was on the plane, and it landed right on time. So he didn't miss his flight, Ruth Rose said through strawberry pink lips. That's right. Dink pulled out the itinerary. He drew a line through airport. This is so exciting, Ruth Rose said. Now what? Josh asked, working on his double dipper. Dink pointed to his next circle on the itinerary. Now we need to find out if a taxi picked him up, he said. Lawrence Taxi is over by the river, Ruth Rose said. Dink looked at Mavis. Would you like to come with us? We can walk there in 5 minutes. Mavis Green wiped her lips carefully with her napkin. I'd love to come, she said in her soft voice. They left Ellie's Diner and walked left on Bridge Lane, then headed down Woodview Road toward the river. Mr. Paskey looked pretty upset, didn't he? Josh said, crunching the last of his cone. His chin was green. Wouldn't you be upset if you had a bunch of customers at your store waiting to meet a famous author and he didn't show up? Ruth Rose asked. Yeah, but he was sweating buckets, Josh said. I wonder if Mr. Paskey kidnapped Wallace Wallace. Josh, get real. Why would Mr. Paskey kidnap an author? Asked Ruth Rose. He sells tons of Wallace's books. I don't think Mr. Paskey is the kidnapper, Dink said. But in a way, Josh is right. Detectives should consider every suspect just the way they do it in Wallace's books. At River Road, they turned left. 2 minutes later, Dink pushed open the door of the Lawrence Taxi Service office. He asked the man behind the counter if one of their drivers had met Flight 3132 at Bradley Airport the previous night. The man ran his fingers down the list on a clipboard. That would be Maureen Higgins. She's out back eating her lunch, he said, pointing over his shoulder. Walk straight through. They cut through the building to the grassy area and back. Through the trees, Dink could see the Indian River. The sun reflected off the water like bright coins. A woman was sitting at a picnic table eating a sandwich and filling out a crossword puzzle. Excuse me, are you Maureen Higgins? Dink asked. The woman shook her head without looking up. Nope, I'm Marilyn Monroe. The woman wrote in another letter. Then she looked up. She had the merriest blue eyes Dink had ever seen. Yeah, cutie pie, I'm Maureen. She pointed her sandwich at Dink. And who might you be? Well, I'm Dink Duncan, he said. These are my friends, Josh, Ruth Rose, and Mavis. We wondered if you could help us, Ruth Rose asked. There's Maureen Green. Maureen stared at them. How? Did you pick up the man named Wallace Wallace at the airport last night? Dink asked. Maureen squinted one of her blue eyes. Why do you want to know? Because he's missing, said Josh. Well, I sure ain't got him. Maureen took a bite out of her sandwich. Mayonnaise oozed onto her fingers. I know, we didn't think you had him, Dink said, but did you pick him up? Maureen nodded, swallowing. Sure, I picked him up, 7 o'clock sharp. I was there with my sign saying Wallace. The guy spots me, trots over. I take him out to my taxi, he climbs in, carrying a small suitcase. Kind of spooky guy. Dressed in a hat, a long raincoat, sunglasses. Sunglasses at night. Doesn't speak a word, just sits. Spooky. Did you take him to the Shangri-La Hotel? Dink asked. Yep, those were my orders. Guy didn't have to give directions, but it would have been nice if he'd said something. Pass the time, you know. A lot of people, they just chat to act friendly, not this one. Quiet as a mouse in the back seat. Maureen wiped mayonnaise from her fingers and lips. I don't like that picture. Who is this famous Wallace fella anyway? He's a famous writer, Ruth Rose said. Maureen's mouth fell open. You mean I had a celebrity in my cab and never knew it? What happened when you got to the hotel? Josh asked. Maureen stood up and tossed her napkin into the trash. I get out on my side and I open his door. He hops out, hands me a 20. Last I seen, he's scooting into the lobby. Dink pulled out the itinerary. He crossed out taxi with thick black line. Then he drew a question mark next to hotel. Thanks a lot, Miss Higgins, he said. Sorry, I got confused here. Oh, come on, guys. I have a feeling we're getting closer to finding Wallace Wallace. Maureen put her hand on Dink's arm. I just thought of something, she said. When he handed me my fare, this Wallace fellow was smiling. Smiling? She nodded. Yep. He had this silly grin on his face like he knew some big secret or something. Chapter 5. Back on Main Street, Dink adjusted his backpack and led the way to the Shangri-La Hotel. Maureen Higgins said she dropped him off at the hotel last night, he said to the others. So that's our next stop. Well, what if she didn't? Josh said, catching up to Dink. What do you mean? Maybe Maureen Higgins wasn't telling the truth. Maybe she kidnapped him. And she's hiding him in her lunchbox? Ruth Rose said. Very funny, Ruth Rose, Josh said. Maureen Higgins said she drove Wallace Wallace to the hotel. But what if she drove him somewhere else? You could be right, Dink said. That's why we're going to the hotel. With Dink in the lead, the four approached the check-in counter in the hotel lobby. Excuse me, Dink said to the man behind the counter. May we help you? He was the saddest-looking man Dink had ever seen. He had thin black hair and droopy eyebrows. His skinny mustache looked like a sleeping centipede. A name tag on his suit coat said, Mr. Linkletter. We're looking for someone. Mr. Linkletter stared at Dink. He's supposed to be staying here in this hotel, Josh said. The man twitched his mustache at Josh. Is that good twitching? His name is Wallace Wallace, Dink explained. Can you tell us if he checked in last night? Mr. Linkletter patted his mustache. Young sir, if we had such a guest, we wouldn't give out any information. We have rules at the Shangri-La, he added in a deep, sad voice. But he's missing, Ruth Rose said. He was supposed to be at the Book Nook this morning, and he never showed up. Dink pulled out the itinerary. See? He was coming here from the airport. The taxi driver said she saw him walk into this lobby. And he's famous, Ruth Rose said. She placed her book on the counter in front of Mr. Linkletter. He wrote this. Sighing, Mr. Linkletter looked down at Ruth Rose. We are quite aware of who Mr. Wallace is, young lady. I'm sorry, young miss. Mr. Linkletter turned his sad eyes back on Dink. He flipped through the hotel register, glanced at it, then quickly shut the book. Yes, Mr. Wallace checked in, he said. He arrived at 8:05. He did? What happened after that? Dink asked. Mr. Linkletter pointed toward a bank of elevators. He went to his room. We offered to have his suitcase carried, but he preferred to do it himself. Have you seen Mr. Wallace yet today? Mavis asked. No, madam, I haven't seen him. Mr. Wallace is still in his room. Suddenly, Dink felt relieved. He felt a little foolish, too. Wallace hadn't been kidnapped after all. He was probably in his room right now. Can you call him? Dink asked. Mr. Linkletter tapped his fingers on the closed hotel register. He patted his mustache and squinted his eyes at Dink. Please, Dink said. We just want to make sure he's okay. Finally, Mr. Linkletter turned around. He stepped a few feet away and picked up a red telephone. As soon as his back was turned, Josh grabbed the hotel register. He quickly found yesterday's page. Dink and the others crowded around Josh for a peek. Dink immediately recognized Wallace's signature scrawled in big, loopy letters. He had checked in to room 303 at 8:05 last night. Dink pulled out his letter from Wallace and compared the signatures. They were exactly the same. Josh dug his elbow into Dink's side. Look, he whispered. Josh was pointing at the next line in the register. Room 302 had been printed there. Check-in time was 8:15. Someone else checked in right after Wallace, Ruth Rose whispered. Here he is, Mr. Linkletter, his centipede mustache. But the signature is all smudged, Dink said. I can't read the name. When Mr. Linkletter hung up the phone, Josh shoved the register away. As Mr. Linkletter turned back around, Dink shut the register. He looked up innocently. Is he in his room? Dink asked. I don't know. Mr. Linkletter tapped his fingers on his mustache. There was no answer. Dink's stomach dropped. His mind raced. If Wallace had checked into his room last night, why hadn't he shown up at the book nook today? And why wasn't he answering his phone? Maybe Wallace had been kidnapped after all. Chapter 6. Dink stared at Mr. Linkletter. No answer? Are you sure? Mr. Linkletter nodded. He looked puzzled. Perhaps he's resting and doesn't want to be disturbed. Can we go up and see? Ruth Rose smiled sweetly at Mr. Linkletter. Then we'd know for sure. Mr. Linkletter shook his head. We cannot disturb our guests, young miss. We have rules at the Shangri-La. Now, good day, and thank you. Ruth Rose opened her mouth. Good day, Mr. Linkletter said firmly again. Dink and the others walked toward the door. Something smells fishy, muttered Dink. Yeah, Josh said, and I think it's that Linkletter guy. See how he tried to hide the register, then he turned his back? Maybe he didn't even call room 303. Maybe he was warning his partners in crime. What are you suggesting, Josh? Mavis asked. Maybe Mr. Linkletter is the kidnapper, Josh said. He was the last one to see Wallace. Josh is thinking that everyone's a kidnapper. First he thought Mr. Paskey was, and then he thought Maureen Green was, and now he thinks that Mr. Linkletter is. A man wearing a red baseball cap tapped Dink on the shoulder. Excuse me, but I overheard you talking to my boss, Mr. Linkletter. Maybe I can help you find Wallace. My kids love his books. Great, said Dink. Can you get us into his room? The man shook his head. No, but I know the maid who cleaned the third-floor rooms this morning. Maybe she noticed something. With his back to Mr. Linkletter, the man scribbled a few words on a pad and handed the page to Dink. Good luck, the man whispered and hurried away. What'd he write? Josh asked. Outside, Dink said. They all shoved through the revolving door. In front of the hotel, Dink looked at the piece of paper. The maid's name is Olivia Nugent. She lives at the Acorn Apartments, number 4. Livy Nugent, I know her, Ruth Rose said. She used to be my babysitter. The Acorn is right around the corner on Oak Street, Dink said. Let's go. Soon, all 4 were standing in front of Livy Nugent's door. She answered it with the baby in her arms. Another little kid held onto her leg and stared at Dink and the others. He had peanut butter all over his face and in his hair. Hi, the boy's mother said. I'm not buying any cookies, and I already got the Green Lawn Gazette. She was wearing a man's blue shirt and jeans. Her brown hair stuck out in front of her Yankees baseball cap. Livy, it's me, Ruth Rose said. Olivia stared at Ruth Rose and then broke into a grin. Okay, I'm reading, okay? Ruth Rose, you're so big. What happened to you? What are you up to these days? A man at the hotel gave us your name. What man? He was sort of old, wearing a red cap, Dink said. Livy chuckled. Freddie old? He's only 30. So why did he send you to me? Dink told us that, oh, okay, so I'm recording. Look, say hi. And if you move that, the recorder's gonna fall. So we have to leave that right there, okay? Okay, so just put your hands right here. I'm almost done with this book. Hi! Okay. He's only 30, so why did he send you to see me? He told us you cleaned the rooms on the 3rd floor this morning, Dink said. Did you clean room 303? Livy Nugent shifted the baby to her other arm. Randy, please stop pulling on Mommy's leg. Why don't you go finish your lunch? Randy ran back into the apartment. No, Livy told Dink. Nobody slept in that room. The bed was still made this morning. The towels were still clean and dry. I remember because there were 2 rooms in a row that didn't have to be clean, 303 and 302. Room 302 had a do not disturb sign hanging on the doorknob, so I came home early, paid off the babysitter, and made our lunches. But Mr. Linkletter told us Wallace checked into room 303 last night, Ruth Rose said. Not the Wallace, the mystery writer? My kid sister devours his books. Dink nodded. He was supposed to sign books at the book nook this morning, but he never showed up. We even saw his signature on the hotel register, Ruth Rose said. Well, Wallace might have signed in, but he never slept in that room, Livy grinned, unless he's a ghost. I wonder if Mr. Linkletter could have made a mistake about the room number, Mavis suggested quietly. Livy smiled at Mavis. You must not be from around here. Mr. Linkletter never makes mistakes. So Wallace signed in, but he didn't sleep in his room, said Dink. That means someone must have kidnapped him before he went to bed, Josh said. Livy's eyes bugged. Kidnapped? Geez, Mr. Linkletter will have a fit.
Mom.
She imitated his voice. We have rules about kidnapping at the Shangri-La. Everyone except Dink laughed. All he could think about, let me finish, okay? All he could think about was Wallace, his favorite author, kidnapped. Suddenly a crash came from inside the apartment. Oops, gotta run, Livy said. Randy is playing bulldozer with his baby sister's stroller again. I hope you find Wallace. My kid sister will die if he doesn't write another book. They walked slowly back to Main Street. Dink felt as though his brain was spinning around inside his head. Now he felt certain that Wallace had been kidnapped. But who did it, and when? And where was Wallace being kept? Guys, I'm feeling confused, he said. Can we just go sit somewhere and go over the facts again? Good idea, Josh said. I always think better when I'm eating. I'm feeling a bit peckish too, Mavis said. I need a quiet cup of tea and a sandwich. Should we meet again after lunch? Ruth Rose looked at her watch. Let's meet at 2 o'clock. Where? Josh asked. Back at the hotel. Oh, thank you for your feet. Back at the hotel. Dink peered through the door glass at Mr. Linkletter. Unless Maureen Higgins and Mr. Linkletter are both lying, he said. Wallace walked into the Shangri-La last night, and he never came out. All right, that was the end of chapter 6. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll do another one. Chapter 7, 8, and 9. Okay, say bye.
Bye.
Bye. Say keep reading.
Keep reading.
Okay, bye.